we will pick up here with notes for assignment A5, starting here with solving equations. So you see that our goal is to get the variable by itself. And in order to do that, we need to use opposite operations. And when I say opposite operations, think the opposite of addition would be subtraction, but we can go the other way and say, well, the opposite of subtraction is addition, so it works both ways. Same with multiplication and division. The opposite of multiply is divide, the opposite of divide is multiply. And then we want to make sure that what we do to one side, we do to the other. So we've got to stay fair and balanced in an equation. So whenever I go into an equation, I always try to divide it down by the equal sign, left side, right side. I find my variable term. I want to find it, but I don't want to do anything with it at first. I want to actually see what's happening to the term. So on the same side as the x term is a minus 9, so I'm going to do the opposite there and do a plus 9. Those actually undo each other or cancel each other out because a negative 9 and a positive 9 is 0. But I also have to do it to the other side of the equation, and now I can get the solution. So with the 9's canceled out, I'm left with x equals, and then I can just add up the 3 plus 9 and get 12. You can always check your answer. You can just plug in that value in. The value that you get for the x, if you plug it in and check the math, that would say that 12 minus 9 equals 3, and that checks out. 12 minus 9 does equal 3. So that's the process I'm going to go through. These first 6 or 9 problems will end up just being what we call one-step equations, and then we'll get into more that have multiple steps. So let's look at number 13. Find your x term. Find out what's happening to that. I see a plus 2 on the same side. The opposite of adding 2 is subtracting 2. Oops, I didn't find my left and right side there at the equal sign. So a positive 2 and a negative 2 cancel. I want to make sure I put the negative 2 on the other side, or the minus 2. That leaves me an x on the left. And negative 4 minus 2, using those integer rules or using your calculator, is a negative 6. Again, find your variable. This time it's a y, and this time it's on the right-hand side, but that's okay. What's happening on the same side of the y is a minus 3, so I'm going to do the opposite and add 3. A negative 3 and a positive 3 cancel. A negative 7 and a positive 3 on the left-hand side is a negative 4, and that equals y. And you can just leave it just like that if you want. If you prefer to write y equals negative 4, that means the same thing. Number 15, find your x. What's happening to x? Well, 2.7 is being added, so we are going to subtract 2.7. And do the same thing to the right-hand side. 2.7's cancel. I've got an x left. And when I take negative 5.3 and subtract 2.7, that ends up giving me a negative 8. Find your variable. Look and see what's happening. Minus 1.8. So we're going to add 1.8. Those cancel. So I'm left with z equals negative 12 plus 1.8 is negative 10.2. Check those in the calculator. Make sure you're typing it in correctly so that you know on test day you can be confident that you're using your calculator correctly. Find your variable term. What's happening to it? I keep forgetting my line at the equal sign. It's a positive 9.4. The opposite is a negative or minus 9.4 to the left and the right. Positive and negative 9.4 cancels, leaves me with x on the left, and a positive 3.25 minus 9.4 is negative 6.15. Please use your calculator for those. You want to make sure that you are getting the right value there. We will move on to the next page and do a couple of more that are considered one-step equations. Now this time when I find my x term, it actually has a number attached to it. So this is like saying 4 times x when they're bumped up next to each other. There's no plus sign, no minus sign. Bumped up together is multiplication. And the opposite of multiplication is division. And just like in our previous notes, we've talked about a fraction meaning division. I'm going to show dividing by 4 like a fraction bar. What I do to the left, I have to do to the right. 4 divides out 4. That just gives me 1. 1x is just x. And then 20 divided by 4 is 5. Now, if you do write the 1 with the x, that is okay. But it is not necessary. You can, eventually, throughout the course, you'll get in the habit of dropping that 1. Number 19, find your x term. Again, the term has a number attached to it, which means that it's being multiplied by a value. So the opposite of multiplying by 2 is dividing by 2. Got to do it to the left and the right side. Those 2's divide out and leave me with x. And on the left-hand side, 5 divided by 2, it's actually fine to just leave it 5 over 2 in fraction form. As long as the fraction is simplified, you can stop right there. If it divides to a nice decimal, this one would be 2.5. You could also give it as a decimal answer. So I would be okay with either of those answers. But if it's a decimal that repeats, then you want to stick to the fraction answer because we don't want any rounding. Rounding causes your answer to not be accurate. So you just want to keep the fraction form in the lowest terms. All right, when I find my variable term this time, it's just got a negative attached to it. Now that negative can also be seen as a negative 1. And if it's attached to it, it means it's being multiplied by a negative 1. So the opposite would be dividing by negative 1. So then that way, the negative 1 and the negative 1 divide out, leaves me with a positive y. And then a negative 8.25 divided by negative 1 gives me a positive 8.25. All right, then a little bit of division. Our x term has a fraction bar and a negative 8, so attached to the x is division of negative 8. The opposite of dividing by negative 8 would be to times by negative 8. And I'm going to show my times by putting it in parentheses. And what I do to one side, I need to do to the other side. So the negative 8's actually get to cancel there and leave me with the x. Anytime you do the opposite operation, you're canceling or undoing it. And then the left-hand side, negative 8 times 11 is negative 88. Make sure as you're doing your assignments, you're checking with the keys on Blackboard. That way you know that you're on the right track here. So again, my x term here is a fraction. So fractions mean division. Opposite of division is multiplication. I need to multiply by the 5, but I also want to multiply by the negative because I want my variable to be positive. And the way to cancel out a negative is to multiply by a negative. And what I do to the left, I'm going to do to the right. So those negative 5's cancel. X equals negative 20. Now, number 23 could be the beginning of what we would call two-step equations. Because of the fraction out there, we can do this a couple of different ways. But since you have a calculator at this point, we can do this pretty much the same way we did 18, 19, and 20. because the x has a fraction attached to it, or has a number attached to it. So that means it's 3/4 times x. So the opposite of timesing by 3/4 is dividing by 3/4 on both sides. Now that looks really horrible, so we can go to the calculator to do that math. Let's actually go to the calculator together here. Okay, so that said 7, and we want to divide by a fraction. And I'm going to put that fraction in parentheses just so I can see what I'm dividing by. 3 divided by 4. Enter, and that gives us a decimal, and you notice it's a repeating decimal. So remember, in some previous notes we talked about making a decimal into a fraction. This is math, enter, enter, and it'll turn it into a fraction for us. Also, if you're on the 84 like I am, you can do alpha and the y equals and hit enter. We can put our 7 in our numerator, and if we go down to our denominator, that's where there's a fraction, so I can do alpha y equals again. And now I've got that fraction in the denominator, and I can type in the 3/4, and then if I hit enter, it puts it in a fraction form for me. So either way, it is 28/3. So I did number 23 in one step. You could multiply both sides by 4 to undo the dividing by 4, and then come through and divide both sides by 3. But if that made sense to you, you'll be able to use that method. Number 24 is the beginning of two-step equations. Here's my x term. It has a 3 attached to it. But I also, on the same side, have a -2. So we need to get the x by itself first. So the way to do that is to move anything that's being added or subtracted. So first, undo addition or subtraction. So this one has subtraction. A -2, the opposite is +2 on both sides. That leaves me with 3x on the left. 17 plus 2 is 19. Now I can do my division, because remember, when a number is attached to the x, that means it's multiplied. So we are going to divide by the 3. And that gives me x equals 19/3. Put that in the calculator real quick. That's another repeating fraction, repeating decimal, 6.33333. So you can just leave it as 19/3. Number 25, when we find our variable term, it's being divided by 3, but I also see a +4. So if we're undoing addition and subtraction first, I'm going to undo the +4 with a -4. So +4 -4 cancels. I've still got my t/3, and now it equals 6. 10 minus 4 is 6. And now I can finish out getting that t by itself. It's being divided by 3, so we're going to times by 3. And that gives me t equals 18. Solving equations is going to be a very big part of any of your math classes, so make sure you are comfortable with this. Find your x term on 26. It's being multiplied by 5, and I have a +3, so I'm going to start with that +3 and do the opposite, and go to the other side of the equals and do the same thing. 23 minus 3 is 20, and that's going to equal the 5x. And now I can undo that multiplication with x by dividing by 5. So this says 4 equals x, or x equals 4. Let's do a couple of more of these two-step equations. Find your x. Now this time I'm actually going to highlight the sign attached to it. So the negative 7x if I'm just looking at that one term. So I see that and I see a 4. So I want to move that constant, that 4, first. And this is going to be a tricky one because even though it's a subtraction problem, the 4 is not being subtracted. The 4 is a positive number. And the only way to cancel out a positive 4 is a negative 4 or to minus 4 from it. And so do that to both sides. 4 minus 4 is 0. That cancels it. And I'm left with a negative 7x. 18 minus 4 is 14. And now I'm going to do the division, but make sure you divide by a negative 7 because a negative divided by a negative is positive. So we're dividing by exactly what the number is attached to the x. Those divide out, x equals negative 2. Find your x term. Again, it's negative, but this time the 10 is being added, and we'll do the opposite of that, plus, that adding, and minus. So that leaves me with the negative 4x on the left. Negative 2 minus 10 is negative 12. Again, make sure if you're not comfortable with integer rules that you're typing that into the calculator correctly. And then we have to divide last. We're dividing by the whole negative 4. So all of that cancels and x equals positive 3. And then one more of these. Anytime you want, feel free to pause the video, try the problem yourself, and then play the video and see if you did it right. Now may be a good time to pause the video. Here's my x term. I also see a plus 5.8, so I'm going to minus 5.8. So that's going to leave me a negative x on the left, and negative 27.3 minus a 5.8 is a negative 33.1. And we've had one of these before, a negative x. That's like saying we have a negative 1x. So we want to go through and divide by negative 1. Dividing by negative 1 just changes your sign. So now I have a positive x, and now I'm going to equal a positive 33.1. Since the problem had decimals in it, decimal answers are just fine. Okay, so you notice we've got number 30 has some parentheses in it. So I'm actually going to come over here to this little corner that we have and write down some steps, because now we're getting past two-step equations. And so there's a nice order that you can do these. So we're going to call this 2 plus steps. And the first thing we want to do, and you've already gone through notes and homework for the distributive property. So the first thing you want to do is distribute. Because the x in these next three problems is trapped inside the parentheses. So the distributing has to happen first. Then you want to move the constant I'm going to scoot this over a little bit for a second, using adding and subtracting. So remember, that first move is undoing any adding or subtracting. The constant is just the number by itself. That's what a constant is. And then your third step would be move the coefficient using multiply, divide. And these last two steps is actually what we've been doing on our two-step equations. The plus just means there's something else that looks a little bit different, which is the parentheses in this case. And then just to make sure we know, coefficient is the number with the variable. The coefficient is the number with the variable. So steps 2 and 3 we've been doing on those previous problems we were just working. Right now we're adding step 1, and we're going to use that for problem number 30 here. So I see parentheses. I'm going to use the distributive property. That 3 needs to get multiplied through. So 3 times 3x is 9x. 3 times negative 5 is a negative 15. And then we can just bring down the equals 10, because once we get to the parentheses, we're done. Now it's a two-step problem. So now we can move that constant. Here's my x term. My constant is a minus 15, so I'm going to plus 15. So we've got 9x equals 10 and 15 is 25. And then the 9 attached to the x means multiplication, so we're going to divide. And 25 and 9 don't have anything in common, so we can just keep it 25 ninths. We're going to do that again. So the number outside of the parentheses gets distributed, so I can keep the 3 equals, and then 2 times x is 2x. 2 times 6, everything's positive, so that's plus 12. And again, we are a two-step equation from here. So there's my x term. I want the constant, which is the number by itself. It's added, so we're going to subtract it. 3 minus 12 is negative 9. That equals our 2x, and our last step is typically division, and it is here. Divide by 2. Again, 9 and 2 are not divisible, so we can just keep it in that fraction form. If you would like, because it's a nice decimal, you can say it's negative 4.5. All right, parentheses again, so we're distributing that 8. I'm going to keep the 40 equals. 8 times 1 is still 8. 8 times 0.5x, so 8 times 0.5. 0.5 is a half, so I'm thinking half of 8, so that's 4x. If you're not sure on that, go to your calculator. Here's my x term. I want to move the 8. The 8 is positive, so we will subtract. 40 minus 8 is 32, and what's left on the right is 4x, and my last step is division. So this time x equals 8. All right, 33 is a little bit different. And earlier on 30, 31, 32, I said that the x was trapped inside the parentheses. Well, if you notice on 33, it's not an x, it's a p, but the variable is not inside the parentheses. That variable p is being multiplied by all of this junk. I'm just going to call it junk so I don't have to read all of that, because I'm going to have to read it a few times here. So if it's being multiplied, the opposite of multiply is divide. And I can just go ahead, because I know I'm going to be using a calculator. Instead of finding out what this answer is, let's not worry about it. Let's just divide both sides by the junk. So junk cancels junk, so the right side has p, and the left side is where we're going to go to our calculator. All right, so in our calculator, if you have your 84 and you want to do alpha y equals, enter, you've got a fraction form. I'm going to not do that, so I feel like more people may have 83, so I'm going to do it the 83 way. So it starts with 2.15, and we are dividing by, and notice even in the problem, it had parentheses around everything. You have to type it this way. Parentheses 1 plus 0.10, open another set of parentheses so you can do 3/4, which is 3 divided by 4, close it on the fraction, close it on the whole thing, hit enter, and all that junk equals 2. And then 34 is easier than it looks. 34, my t is right, or my variable is that t right there, but it's just being multiplied. It's being multiplied by 100, and it's being multiplied by 0.08. So what if we just multiplied that out? What is 100 times 0.08? Well, that's just 8. And now the problem looks so much simpler. 8t equals 1250. Opposite of multiplying is dividing. Divide both sides by 8. And this one, it has a decimal in it, so I'm okay with the decimal answer. 156 and 25 hundredths. 156.25. All right, now hopefully you feel good about solving equations.